The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents A Miracle Healing? The story of Marlen Klepees. So, this came up during a recent debate that I did on whether or not the resurrection of Jesus is a historical event. My debate opponent, Than Christopoulos, mentioned during our Q&A back and forth, this is on his video of this, it should be at 1 hour, 49 minutes and about 53 seconds or so. And this is a quote from him, or very nearly a quote. It's possible that I got an or something off. If you have a miracle account with an associated Christophany, and that Christophany predicts, hey, go reach out to this person and you're going to be prayed for and you're going to be healed of cerebral palsy, which you've had for 30 plus years. You're paraplegic. You have the brain scans to prove it. It's biologically impossible to be healed. You get prayed for by that same person. That's where he said, this is the story of Marlen Klepees. Now, there's a handful of interesting things in that, and I'm not here to dig in on Than right away because, you know, everybody's going to make mistakes. She did not have cerebral palsy for 30 years. She was healed at roughly the age of 19. And there's a number of other problems, but Than's characterization of this is, the story is there's a Christophany, which is a vision or an appearance that is purportedly of Christ, saying, hey, reach out to this person and you're going to be healed. And then she reached out to that person and she was healed. And somebody needs to stick a pin in this claim that he specifically lists being healed from cerebral palsy as biologically impossible. This is in a debate where he used kind of a Bayesian analysis to assess the likelihood that the resurrection of Jesus was a historical event. And his point two wasn't that it was biologically impossible, which I would say it would be very easy to say a resurrection is biologically impossible. But what he instead listed was not too improbable, or that the prior was not so low as to disqualify it, which is kind of like saying it's not impossible. And so it's strange that one thing is referred to as biologically impossible to kind of increase the significance of this. I wonder what the prior probability of a biologically impossible healing from cerebral palsy is, because, you know, did this actually happen? So setting aside that error of whether or not she had this for 30 years and the very, very heavy lifting that even mentioning a Christophany is doing, I tried to research this case, this miracle healing of Marlen Klepees. And I kept finding the same videos. You can go search yourself. You'll find videos of her telling her story, of her presentations at churches. There's several of them on the internet. You'll find old clips from Christian television programs and everything else. And I was immediately unimpressed. The telling of the story was kind of, you know, movie of the week dramatizations, and quite even some of the YouTube videos have like video footage where it's like, not Marlene, not Marlene, not Marlene, because there isn't footage and there isn't good documentation on this case. And so I reached out to Than to ask him to make sure I had gotten the right person. He sent me this PDF file, which I'm going to pull up and go through. And also we, when I said I wasn't that impressed and I'd done some research, he sent me a few other documents as well. But we're going to start with this PDF. And I don't think I'm going to read every detail of it, but I am going to go through a great deal of it. And it's very likely that this is going to upset some people and that there are people who are going to be, oh, that's, you know, this is what happens when a skeptic gets a hold of something. Yes. This is what happens when a skeptic gets a hold of something. And if in fact there were good reason to think that these events were true and a miracle healing, there would be no skeptic that could raise questions to demolish this so absolutely effortlessly. I say effortlessly. I actually spent quite a bit of time researching this, but as it turns out, though, when I looked into this, I recognized the story. Now, I can't recall exactly. It's possible that Marlene is from Missouri, and these events happened to some extent in Missouri, and I think she still lives in Missouri and maybe runs a flower store or something in a small town. But it's possible that she came and visited my church, or it's possible that I went to some revival or something and heard her testimony, or it's possible I just heard it like on CBN or something at some point, but it was not completely unfamiliar to me. And this is a story that happened in 1980, 81, 82, is when the healing, and then when she started running around to churches and things ministering. So I'm going to go through this PDF and I'm going to point out a number of problems. Now, in addition to this PDF, I also searched all over the internet, found a number of different articles. I checked into every one of the references that are listed in the footnotes for this article, as well as reaching out to 2 different physicians to have them review the material and find out what they thought. This is a combination of questions that I had as a skeptic and objections that physicians had as well. So if we start at the beginning of this, it says, born prematurely in 1962, Marlene Klepees, I'm not completely sure how to pronounce her name, as it is spelled and misspelled a variety of different ways, including in some of the documentation I was sent. But Marlene weighed only 1 pound, 14 ounces. Now there's a little number 1 there so that you can check the footnotes for that. That is, publications that discuss this matter include Weishart Ian, miraculously cured of cerebral palsy, The Encourager, March 2012, which is itself an abridged version of Weishart's earlier excerpt from his book, The Divinity Code, and a couple other things. Medical documentation is cited in video testimonial and reenactment of the miracle. Woman healed of cerebral palsy. There's a link to a CBN video there. And Investigate magazine, December 2006. So here's the first claim is she was born in 1962 and weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces. I have found no medical documentation of that. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying I can't make any statement about it, but that's not what she was healed or cured of, so it really doesn't matter. Just saying she was born prematurely and weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces. But when you put footnotes in your article, the footnote should be relevant to that point. And since the first line says she weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces in 1962, there is nothing in that first footnote that predates 1996, and none of it is medical records about her birth. In fact, I was sent a screenshot of one of the, oops, that's not right. This is where in the footnote it lists that there are screenshots of medical records, but what you can see in the screenshots of those medical records is that Marlene is a 19, as in a 19-year-old on the left one, and the right one says 18-year-old white female was admitted. So these are medical records from when she was 18 or 19 that don't address the fact that she was born in 1962 and weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces. That already tells me about the quality of this publication and the footnotes that are in it. The footnotes that are there, in addition to the, I'll get to the other one in a little bit, but we're going to go through what this actual PDF that I was sent says. Just know that right from the very first line, there is a claim with a footnote number, superscript, that has absolutely nothing to do with the claim that's being made in that first sentence. So right out of the gate, we have a big problem. What's listed there are the Encourager from March 2012, that's a Southern Baptist magazine. That was part of an article that was copied from Weishart's The Divinity Code book. There was an excerpt from Miracles Today, and it says medical documentation is cited in a video testimonial and reenactment of the miracle. So you can go to cbn.com/700club/woman-healed-cerebral-palsy-through-vision. Additional photographs of the woman's medical record are in Miracle 1, Marlene Klepees, Cured of Cerebral Palsy, Investigate magazine. That's the one I just showed you. That's from December 2006 and is a New Zealand Christian magazine. So all of these are coming from Christian sources, Christian magazines, Christian miracle magazines. All of them are a show called It's Supernatural from January 2nd, 1996. These are all 24 plus years, 82 to 96. That's 14 years for the first one that they're referencing. And everything else is from 2006, 2012, when this event happened in supposedly 1982. And she was born in 1962. So right off the bat, the first line, we're already wholly unimpressive. As expected, the troubled birth led her to develop brain damage that left her with profound disability, diagnosed as cerebral palsy. There is zero medical documentation of any diagnosis of cerebral palsy in any of the documentation I was given or any of the documentation I could find. Continuing on, her life would only become more tragic as both parents would die in a motorcycle accident years later. Doesn't say how many years later. Leaving the paralyzed baby. There's no evidence that she was a paralyzed baby, to be cared for by her great-grandparents. The child was then passed around to various foster homes. No idea what happened to the great-grandparents or whatever else. At the age of 5, the young girl was finally able to walk. There's no medical documentation that she started walking for the first time at the age of 5 or anything else, with the aid of legs and braces and arm canes, and she had to wear a head aloft system, a leather strap to hold her head up, and needing a bib due to constant salivation. All of this can be true. None of this is documented. As she reached her early teens in the 1970s, her condition initially stabilized, graduating high school with what was described as a fairly mild case of debilitating disease. Now, if she was born in 1962 and she graduated high school at, let's say, 17, that's 1979. So when she graduated high school in 1979, she had what was described as a fairly mild case of a debilitating disease. That phrase was used in a newspaper in 1982. So when we're citing sources close to the events, 1982, she had a fairly mild case of a debilitating disease. When we cite sources from 2006, 2012 that are Christian magazines, she was paralyzed and all this other stuff. It says the tides would turn in 1977 when the disease was called a brainstem injury that would lead to frequent spasms, which caused the girl to swing her body around violently, occasionally resulting in broken bones. This would become progressively more acute from 1977 and 1980 with worsening paralysis and spasticity. Contractures from cerebral palsy would cause her tendons and joints to lose elasticity and become rigid, leaving her hands claw-like and deformed. Her sight would likewise deteriorate and require strong corrective lenses, causing her to have the reading level of a first grader even into her late teens. How do you graduate high school with a fairly mild case of debilitating disease and yet have a reading level of a first grader into your late teens? Maybe they just kept passing her. I'm just saying. The walker would become a wheelchair as paraplegia became more profound. Surgery at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri was originally planned to lengthen the patient's leg tendons, but was canceled due to the severity of her spasticity. No medical documentation of that proposed procedure or, talking to the medical experts, why anything like that would have been done if this was in fact cerebral palsy. By 1980, the condition had progressed to the point where the girl was forced to drop out of the college she had originally planned on enrolling. Okay, so she didn't enroll. She planned on enrolling. You can't drop out of something you haven't actually enrolled in. But Missouri Western University, she planned on enrolling, but dropped out, whatever. As a last-ditch effort, in December of 1980, the 19-year-old would be admitted to St. Mary's Hospital, part of the world-renowned Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. After a particularly devastating seizure episode in the same month that left her unconscious for 2 days, doctors feared that she was brain dead, though she still maintained control of her eyes and parts of her face. On December 28th of 1980, the girl was deemed a quadriplegic, completely paralyzed from the neck down and only able to move her head. So there's no medical documentation of this either. And in this time frame, from December 28th of 1980 through March 31st of 1981, a 2-month or 3-month period, January, February, March, she's referred to in the stories as a quadriplegic and sometimes is a paraplegic. Could be interchangeable, who knows? The story says she spent her days largely bedbound and laying in a fetal position. Medical doctors that I spoke to objected to that, as nurses would have to turn her over every 2 hours. Marlene would lose the ability to speak clearly and would communicate with nurses primarily through single words and grunts. Treatments led to no improvement. Medical records from the Mayo Clinic mentioned that Marlene had been under the care of, among other physicians, Dr. Henry Hebert Stonington, a world-renowned specialist in physical rehabilitation, and later founder of the Journal of Traumatic Brain Injury. Now, in the screenshot I showed you, it did show Dr. Stonington's name. There are no documents and no interviews with this doctor or any other medical staff. There are no medical records that are produced for any of this. A picture of an admission, a part of a picture of an admission report, and that's it. It says, yet even specialists from the country's most prestigious hospital were unable to help her condition as she grew more sick. Documentation described Marlene's condition as continually unimproved in the early months of 1981, with note of the patient's continued inability to walk and being drastically underweight at 116 pounds. A hospital record from January 5th states that the spasticity has progressed. Her spasms are infrequent but can last for a long duration. Another letter 1 month later, in February 26, noted that she could still not move her four extremities despite attempts at physiotherapy. There's a lot here. We haven't even gotten to the potential miracle thing yet. This is just all about, in December of 1980, she has to drop out of a college she planned to enroll in order to go into the hospital because she's now a quadriplegic. And yet the medical reports list her as inability to walk, which is unnecessary once you list a quadriplegic diagnosis. And that her spasticity has progressed, but she still couldn't move her four extremities. This is just over that 3-month period, January, the full month of January, the full month of February, and eventually the full month of March. There are tons of problems with the medical reports on this, not the least of which is that they had her laying in a fetal position, which one of the doctors said that's not the way things would have been done. Then there was confusion of whether she was listed as a quadriplegic or a paraplegic and why they would then list her as unable to walk, and saying things like she still has no voluntary finger movement. But it's weird to list voluntary finger movement as opposed to involuntary finger movement, which would be a different diagnostic characteristic. I'm not a doctor. This is not a full-on investigative report. But right off the bat, from the very first line of this PDF, up through the description of what happened to her while she was in St. Mary's, has a bunch of problems and has absolutely zero documentation of any of the medical diagnosis. There is just a partial picture of an admission report of an 18 or 19-year-old that's complaining that she can't walk. Continuing, it says, during this period, Marlene's faith eroded alongside her health. The girl had accepted Christ at the age of 12 and had always been devout in her Christian faith, but the patient admitted that she grew cold towards God for making her go through progressively debilitating symptoms of her condition. She recalls praying to God to leave her alone if he was not going to cure her. She wanted nothing more to do with him. Yet the paraplegic was given a vision in the second week of March in which Jesus showed her an image of a man in a pinstripe suit, followed by a young girl happily riding a bike in a new dress. Marlene realized this girl was her and inferred that God was informing her that she would be healed. Suddenly, large text appeared before her eyes that read March 29th, 1981, a date that was only 3 weeks away. The pieces now fitted neatly into the puzzle. Marlen Klepees believed that Christophany was promising a complete healing by March 29th. As the date neared, the girl's expectations were instigated further when a dress was sent to her in a mail by a friend, the same dress that she had seen herself in the vision. Well, that's just really cool, and absolutely no way to confirm that she had a vision of the dress that she received before she received it. No way to confirm that. At this point, she's evidently only able to communicate through grunts. While the patient's emotional health improved, her physical health was anything from ameliorated. A Mayo Clinic document from March 25th stated that Marlene's paralysis had progressed, with Marlene remaining largely immobile and noting that she still has no voluntary finger movement. So is she paralyzed from the neck down? Or does she just have no voluntary finger movement and an inability to walk? Even more disheartening was the letter's lack of positive prognosis, and it recommended for the 19-year-old to be discharged to receive permanent care in an assisted living facility. Marlene has been at the clinic for 2 months. Her finances from her estate are practically depleted. The patient will be discharged in approximately 2 weeks period of time unless there's been significant progress. She will be dismissed to a nursing home in Missouri. With the date of her healing only 4 days away, Marlene needed a miracle now more than ever. Wow, we've got the makings of a great story. What a shame there's absolutely no way to confirm the details of any of this. Hey, your money's going to run out and we're going to move you to an assisted living facility because we can't do anything to treat you. Your condition isn't something that we can do anything about. We haven't made any progress. But Marlene supposedly gets a message that she's going to be healed. On the morning of Sunday, March 29, 1981, no immediate improvement was observed, and Marlene still prayed and believed God was speaking to her. Marlene, do not fret. I will still heal you. Get the phone book and have them find the man who will pray for your recovery. Now, I just did a video on how clearly God can communicate. This was God supposedly speaking to Marlene, saying, do not fret. I will still heal you. Get the phone book and have them find the man who will pray for your recovery. Why is God sending a message to Marlene, who can only communicate through mumbles, when he could communicate with the pastor that they're getting ready to send her to? He could communicate with the nurses they're getting ready to send her. He could communicate with literally anybody on the planet. Or he could just miraculously heal her right then without having to jump through all of these absolutely ridiculous, unprovable hoops. But Marlene's nurses came over as she shook her head and mumbled, yellow pages, and she was eventually able to get a nurse to help her look through the yellow pages by grunting and gesturing at the phone book, refusing to eat until her request was granted. Her confused caregivers eventually obliged and brought her a phone book where Marlene gestured to a particular name that stood out on one of the pages, Scott Emerson. The hospital staff then contacted Pastor Emerson, who arrived at the facility later that day. He happened to be wearing a pinstripe suit that Marlene claimed to have seen in her vision, which we can't prove. With limited communication, the paralyzed girl was able to coax the minister into taking her to his church to pray for her. Now, Scott Emerson was not charismatic in denomination, but the minister agreed to pray for her at the church. Accompanied by a nurse, the pastor strapped Marlene in a wheelchair. Straps were needed to prevent her from spasming and falling off the chair, and transported her in a van to the church where the patient was anointed with oil and water. Was anointed with oil and prayer. After several minutes of hands-on prayer, Marlene did not feel any immediate change, but was asked if she wanted to take a step of faith and get out of the wheelchair. In a fit of courage, she lifted herself out of the wheelchair in the presence of many witnesses. Many witnesses, that's impressive. And was able to slowly walk around the church with Emerson, having difficulty from her feet being twisted inward. As the pair made a few more laps around the sanctuary, her feet became straighter with each interval. By the end of the endeavor, the girl had regained full strength in her body. Her club feet were now straightened, her deformed hand opened, her spasms gone, her mental and dialectic impediments vanished. Removal of her thick lenses also revealed that her vision had suddenly returned. Now, this isn't the instantaneous healing that Than mentioned when he summarized this, but, it's still pretty impressive. Step out of your wheelchair, go for a walk around the church a few times, and everything is healed. It's close enough to instantaneous that we'll just let that slide. That night, she arrived back at the Mayo Clinic, walking in herself and asking the receptionist to send some nurses to see Marlene. The receptionist had never heard Marlene speak before, and the girl sat down in the lobby chairs. A nurse by the name of Carrie, who'd been one of Marlene's regular caregivers, walked by, wishing to surprise him. Marlene jovially shouted to him, "Hey, Carrie, don't faint, watch this," before immediately jumping out of the chair and walking around. Upon seeing the girl walk, he became pale and said, "Dear God, this is a miracle. It's amazing." And then everybody stood up and applauded. This is the sort of writing that only encourages mockery of something that might have been a real miracle. There's no documentation of this stuff, and no documentation that she was ever actually ill. But we need to continue, because that's going to be really relevant very soon. A medical review was held the following Tuesday, March 31st, in which Marlene met with a group of 45 physicians for a pre-scheduled meeting to examine her condition and determine if she was set to be sent to receive permanent residence in a nursing home. She expressed great anxiety in attending the meeting, for she had barely been able to talk prior to recovery and felt that her social and communication skills were underdeveloped. Likewise, the girl feared that the doctors would suspect her of faking her disease for 19 years, given her unnatural and instantaneous recovery just 2 days prior. Now, there's more that's getting ready to come up on this issue of whether or not she was faking it. I'm not making a claim that she was faking anything. In fact, I don't think that's the actual explanation. I think the actual explanation is getting ready to come up as we get down here towards the end of this story. The doctors were shocked to see the girl walking, talking, and standing in their presence, questioning her about her vision and the man who prayed for her. A brain scan found no signs of abnormalities or cerebral palsy. Now, so right here, there's claims that there's a brain scan that shows that she doesn't have any abnormalities or cerebral palsy. Where is that brain scan? And where are the brain scans that show abnormalities and cerebral palsy before that? If you're going to engage in a claim of a miracle like this, to broadcast to the world, to show the strength and the power of Almighty God, and you can't produce documentation to show that anybody was actually ever ill or that they actually got better, what's the point? These are the questions that any reasonable person should be asking. These are the points that a skeptic should be asking and addressing. The story of the doctors were shocked to see it and everything else. Continuing on, despite having no voluntary finger movement and no use of lower extremities a few days prior, only moving her arm and hand in the last 2 days, hang on. She went from being a quadriplegic, mad at God that he wouldn't heal her, to being convinced that she was going to be healed. And 2 days prior to that healing, she was suddenly able to move her hand and arm. 2 days prior to her healing, she's suddenly able to move her hand and arm. Were we waiting for a healing or not? Continues on saying her grip was measured 17 points stronger than previous tests would indicate. An easy thing to fake. After deliberation, she was eventually allowed to move back in with her grandparents, though both her guardians and her doctors were worried this was only a temporary remission and that she would relapse back into poor health. That was not the case. The records from checkup performed 6 weeks later in May 81 proved that her health had remained stabilized. And here's a little excerpt quote, supposedly. You returned to the rehabilitation unit that evening, March 29, 1981, walking, something you'd never done since your admission to the unit. When I saw you back at the clinic some weeks later, you had improved even more, and all signs of previous abnormality were gone. You were able to walk perfectly normal, and your eyesight improved so much that you did not need to wear spectacles. We were all thrilled and happy with the outcome of your condition. That quote is supposedly from May of 1981, 6 weeks after the healing. It's not in quotes. It doesn't say who said it. It's referenced evidently in Weishart's book, but no confirmation of any of this. Although I'm happy to believe that part happened. I'm happy to believe that she was walking on March 29th and 6 weeks later, she was even more improved. The problem isn't that she can walk and move around now. The problem is, did she ever have cerebral palsy? Because there's no documentation of any cerebral palsy diagnosis ever. Was she ever paralyzed from the neck down? Or was it psychosomatic? Or was it faked? Continuing on, a year later, the incredible testimony of Marlen Klepees was written up in the May 1982 edition of the Message of the Open Bible, whose columnist Daniel De La Shore reached out to the medical facility to verify the story's accuracy. Here's where I have another screenshot. This is the response, the note at the bottom of that article from Daniel De La Shore. And it says, I called St. Mary's Hospital and talked to Mary Stenber, a nurse on the rehabilitation floor. She told me Marlene was a patient there, and upon her arrival, she was completely helpless. She was in a fetal position, very spastic, and could not communicate well. She also had poor vision. I asked what happened, and she replied that she didn't know. All she knew was that Marlene heard about this faith healer, was prayed for, and came back pushing her wheelchair. I inquired what the doctors thought, and she replied they didn't know what to think. They were just amazed. This phone call confirmed Marlene's testimony and that God is still in the healing business. No, it doesn't. Calling the nurse and getting the nurse's report of, I don't know what happened, but in the late December, a woman came in who reportedly could not walk, and at the end of March, she was pushing her wheelchair after visiting a faith healer, does not confirm a cerebral palsy diagnosis, does not confirm that she was actually paralyzed, does not confirm anything about her condition other than she seemed incapable of walking. And at the end of March, she could start moving her arm around, and then 2 days later, she was miraculously healed just at the exact same moment that she needed to be healed before being moved out of the facility and placed into a new home. It's a miracle. It's not a miracle. It's not remotely impressive. If I continue reading this PDF, at least one of the nurses working the Rehabilitation Center of St. Mary's, Ms. Mary Stanberg, confirmed to the publication that upon the patient's admission, Marlene had been helpless, which is nothing about a diagnosis or anything else. Helpless is a way a lot of people can be described. Curled in a fetal position, which isn't consistent with cerebral palsy or the treatment for it. Had poor vision, cool. Suffered from spasms, fine. When asked about the healing, she replied that all she knew was Mary was prayed over by a faith healer, boom, 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 boom. Marlen Klepees has continued to travel the world for the last 40 years to give her testimony of healing, never having suffered a relapse of symptoms. She still attributes her sudden recovery to her vision of Jesus in 1981. Here's the final paragraph. However one explains Marlene's recovery, it is undeniable that such an immediate and lasting recovery following a Christophany will lead one to raise a few eyebrows. Marlene admits that many of her doctors suspected that her symptoms may have possibly been psychosomatic and that her paralysis could have in part been caused by anxiety and her relationship with her grandparents. She made that admission in 1982. In December of 1980, she goes in. At the end of March 1981, she's healed. By the time 1982 runs around, she's running around testifying at churches. And in an interview, she admits that most of her doctors, this is her own admission according to this, or sorry, not most, many of her doctors suspected that her symptoms may have possibly been psychosomatic and that her paralysis could have in part been caused by anxiety and her relationship with her grandparents. One will also take note of the patient's great expectancy of her cure as predicted by her vision, which may have played a role in her recovery. This is ultimately unlikely, it says. In the same interview, Marlene goes on to say the doctors did become convinced that she did in fact have cerebral palsy and that her condition was incurable. So the only confirmation that any doctor actually thought she had cerebral palsy is what Marlene says, that her doctors did become convinced that she used to have cerebral palsy, which after speaking to two doctors, which I didn't need to do, and nobody should need to do, we know is bullshit. No good doctor becomes convinced that you used to have a disease that many doctors thought might have been a psychosomatic condition after you've been miraculously healed from it. This is the story of Marlen Klepees. My apologies if I've mispronounced the name. The documentation is there in that PDF, and that documentation does not include in any way any confirmation of cerebral palsy, any confirmation of an actual healing. And doctors involved suspected that it may have been psychosomatic. Now, if it was in fact cerebral palsy and a healing from God, why don't we have better documentation? Why don't we have confirmation of the diagnosis? Why don't we have the brain scan showing clear and the brain scan showing the abnormalities? Why don't we have anything but Marlene's word? Where are the interviews with the doctors for the period of time that she was there from December of 1980 through March of 1981. Where are the medical records for that? Why do the medical records list her as quadriplegic, paraplegic, can't walk, no sensation in her fingers? And then we find out late in the story that 2 days before her miraculous healing, she's already starting to move her arm. Look, she had a terrible, rough life. And I'm glad that she's no longer afflicted, whether it was an actual physical illness or something mental. But there is simply not sufficient evidence to conclude that a medical miracle has occurred. And certainly no way to confirm that this was a result of a Christophany or any sort of action at all on behalf of the Christian God. And sorry, then, but even if all of that were true, it still wouldn't add credibility to the resurrection of Jesus. But the fact that this was the cited prime example of someone who had a medically, biologically impossible to heal condition was healed, and it was all verified with scans and everything, when the reality is there are Christian magazines writing these stories, writing them in 1996, writing them in 2006, writing them in 2012, putting them on CBN. In 1982, she was running around to different churches in Missouri, which is where I may have met her or heard about her, or I might have heard something about her story through somebody who attended one of those meetings, because this type of stuff was incredibly common. It was time to have, let's bring in somebody to really liven things up and talk about the wondrousness of God. And here's Marlene with her wonderful story. Except that the story doesn't make any sense at any point, right down to God telling her, hey, get the yellow pages and point, instead of communicating to somebody else. There's a woman in St. Mary's who's been afflicted with cerebral palsy, can barely speak or move. I'm going to heal her, and I want you to be the vessel to do that. I want you to be the vehicle to do that. Or just heal her. I don't know why it had to happen just on the day she was getting discharged, and why we have absolutely no documentation of any illness or any way to confirm a healing. We can't say that this didn't happen. And I wouldn't. And I don't need to. If I had to predict what I think is the most likely explanation after reading this story and listening to two different physicians talk about the diagnosis and treatment, I think you have someone who had an incredibly rough life and was traumatized and stigmatized and had physical conditions that were undiagnosed or improperly diagnosed, that were amplified by anxiety and stress and a difficult home life. And over time, the stories got muddled and confused. When did she graduate? What was her reading level at graduation? Was she actually going to go to college with a first grade reading level? Kind of doubt that, but who knows? There have been plenty of people who were flat out illiterate who managed to find their way into various programs. And then, when that's not going to work, she finds herself in a hospital with a condition that they can't diagnose, they can't treat, not responsive to anything. And then just before she's getting ready to get kicked out and sent to an assisted care living facility because there's nothing more we can do for her, her arm starts moving. And she asks for a yellow pages, finds a preacher, has them call the preacher, who comes and gets her, takes her to church, prays for her, anoints her with oil, and the next thing you know, over a short period in the church, she's walking around and seemingly cured of everything. I understand why believers love a story like this. The problem is, there isn't sufficient evidence to believe that a miraculous healing occurred. This story is embarrassingly poorly documented. And it's an embarrassingly stupid plan to come from the all-knowing, all-wise governor of the universe. To punish someone for 18 or 19 years and then communicate with them and force them to flail around and get a yellow pages only so they can be healed and then go on about their life. This isn't being written up in medical journals. This isn't being touted by any medical authorities as a medical miracle. It's only glurge Christian sources that are publishing this story over and over again, and small churches that like to bring her in every now and then so that she can come in and tell her testimony, which some of them have heard so many times they know it better than she does. And that is almost a direct quote from her mouth in one of the videos. I don't have anything against Marlene or the people who genuinely believe that a miracle might have occurred, except that this is not supported by evidence, is not a good example of a miracle healing. It is embarrassingly bad, and it is disturbing that otherwise reasonably intelligent people could hear this story and either not do sufficient investigation to determine, I don't have good enough reason to believe that this is the way things go, or to have sufficient bias that the mere report of a Christophany, which you can't confirm at all. You can't confirm that she had a vision. You can't confirm she had a vision about a dress before she got the dress. You can't confirm that she had a vision about the pastor or anything else. And you can't confirm that she was actually ill in a way that was biologically impossible to cure. There's no diagnosis of that. What bias is going on that makes someone hear this story and say, there's another one? Our God is a powerful God. Our God is a mighty God. Our God is a loving God to heal. Presenting a Christophany like that and then healing them. In the presence of all that, it's affirmation of what God can do. And it's affirmation that Jesus rose from the dead and this and this and this and this. It is compound anecdotes all the way down. Sure, that'll make some people mad. Sure, Marlene's heard it before. But if this is the best miracle, or one of the best miracles that can be produced, I don't know why we'd bother investigating any of the other ones, because this one has failed epically. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.